Today, the Jewish people celebrate Rosh Hashanah. But if I asked you what the rest of the world was doing right now, what would you tell me? Now, because you live here, your gut instinct, no doubt, would be to tell me that everyone is celebrating the return of college football. But don't worry, I checked with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. I didn't want you to feel left out, which is why I had God schedule Rosh Hashanah for a Wednesday. It was an easy decision when I told him it would give more time for Auburn fans to do teshuvah. It's always so easy to pick on Auburn Jews. I only know like one Jew who went to Auburn, right? But all kidding aside, what is the rest of the world doing right now? Much to your surprise, I would say that if they are not observing the holiday, the most likely thing that they are doing is playing a computer game called Minecraft. Some of you on Zoom might even be playing Minecraft right now. Hopefully no one at shul is at the moment. And I say this because at any given time, there are in our world 126 million people actively using the game Minecraft. To give you a sense, that is 1/3 of the American population. Only for those of you who have never heard of the game, or who are now worried that the sermon is going to be challenging because you may be computer illiterate, I want to assure you, Grandma and Zadie watching from home, there's only one thing you need to know about Minecraft for this sermon. And that is that there are two different ways to play the game. The first way to play the game is in creative mode. The second way to play the game is in survival mode. In the creative mode of Minecraft, your life is near perfect, if not perfect. You are given all of the tools to win the game on a silver platter. There are no bad guys in the game. Your resources are infinite, which makes the purpose of building the game, building, easy. And from its very name, creative mode, one can assume that having every available resource at your disposal will enable that player to unlock the peak of their creative potential. Whereas if you play Minecraft in survival mode, the game, I want to assure you, is much, much harder. You start out with nothing. You have to gather your own resources, and there are lots of bad guys. And because you have all of these obstacles in your way in survival mode, it's assumed you're going to be limited in your creativity. After all, you are merely trying to survive. When the pandemic first started, I have to admit, as I watched Zev become just mildly obsessed with Minecraft, I assumed that these two labels of creativity and survival mode made sense, given the specifications of the game. A game where you had everything, no doubt, would ensure the building of a world with the pinnacle of creativity, whereas having nothing would allow you to just barely subsist, just to barely survive. Only as I watched Zev get really, really good at the game, I discovered an important truth that I want to share with you about the relationship between survival and creativity. And it is a truth that those of us who have started a business or live in the real world and not in a computer fantasy already know. And that's that rarely does real creativity happen when you're given everything. Real creativity only kicks in when you have nothing or everything to lose. Consider for a moment some of humankind's greatest technological advances. Antiseptic medicine was discovered when? During the Civil War. We entered the atomic era in desperate times during the Second World War. General, then President, later George Washington experimented with this radical concept. It was called vaccination, only when he had smallpox-ridden troops at Valley Forge. and Pfizer and Moderna discovered vaccines for the coronavirus only when our lives were the most interrupted. Friends, y'all know what I'm saying. Necessity is the mother of invention. It's only when we are busy fighting for our own survival that we unlock our greatest potential. Even if not everyone sees the world that way, deep down, I think everyone in this room knows that to be true. Why is it that so many people misunderstand the state of Israel? Why are there so many people, let alone Jews, who are poor allies to Israel? According to the Nonpartisan Jewish Electorate Institute, nearly 22% of American Jews claim erroneously that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. That's factually not true. 4% of American Jews believe Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is, quote, the same as the history of racism in America, which in my humble opinion is an insult to African Americans and the struggle they have endured. And so again, given what we know, why is it that so many people don't see what we see? What is and what was at the root of this rot and unfair labeling of Israel that we saw during the conflict of Gaza this summer and that we have continued to see even since? This morning, I want to posit the reason that people seek to make Israel into a pariah is because naive people, among them, let's be clear, ignorant Jews, have deceived and deluded themselves into believing that Israel is playing its game in creative mode. That Israel, and I hate to even use these vile words from the Bema, represents a Jewish privileged colonial power where David has become Goliath, all while conveniently ignoring the facts on the ground. And if you need any stronger reminder of what those facts are, note that Kol Nidre, my original date for this sermon, not only marked 50 years since a group of Israeli athletes were murdered by terrorists at Munich, it marked 50 years of silence in which the world refused to give murdered Jews even a moment of silence at the Olympics until this year. It took 50 years. Friends, what game do you think Israel is playing? Is Israel so successful because it's been given everything? Because it's playing in creative mode? No, Israel is successful because it has been given nothing without a fight. Because we've been playing in survival mode for over 70 years, unless you want to count 4,300 missiles launched at innocent civilians and double standard vilification at the United Nations as having been given something other than a headache. What we saw this summer from some others, including Jews, demonstrates a complete ignorance of history and a divorce from reality that unjustly singles out the most free, diverse, modern state in the Middle East as constantly having to justify its own existence while giving everywhere else a free pass. And yet, it is only in these circumstances of the necessity of trying to survive that Israel has created one of the most innovative societies the world has ever known. Israel, the Hebrew poet Natan Alterman reminds us, was not given to us today, nor to our ancestors on a magash hakesef, on a silver platter. It was born out of the sacrifice of Jews living in survival mode for generations. Bayamim hahem uvazman hazeh. In those days and still today. Think about all you know about Jewish history, folks. the greatest creative breakthroughs in Jewish history took place in the times of greatest persecution. Rabbinic Judaism evolved following the destruction of the temple. Rashi's great epics, commentaries were written during the Crusades. Friends, why does the state of Israel need an Iron Dome, a missile defense system? Why should Israelis have it? It's because, like vaccines, Israel knew this system would ensure its survival and save lives. Not only Israeli ones, but Palestinian ones, by allowing them to avoid a more direct conflict. I'm not sure how many of you saw it this summer, but Hamas complained it wasn't a fair fight. We didn't have our own missile defense system. To which Avi Meir of the American Jewish Committee tweeted brilliantly, "Of course you do. It's called Stop Launching Missiles at Israel. That's your defense system." Why is it that Israel sends search and rescue teams to the sites of natural disasters and building collapses, like in Haiti and in Florida? It's not only because Israel helps only Jews. It's because the Jewish people know what it is like to be abandoned by the world and to struggle to survive. 6 million lives lost later, we will never treat others the same way. When Sahel, the IDF, attacks buildings in Gaza with terrorist headquarters inside, where Hamas launches its rockets from civilian schools and hospitals, Israel first calls those buildings to allow civilians to evacuate. Why? Doesn't this potentially allow terrorist targets to escape? It's because Israel understands that our survival should never come at the expense, ideally, of innocent lives. Friends, the hour grows late, and as we reflect today on the year ahead, I know that it can sometimes feel like we, the Jewish people, and Israel in 5782 are the most privileged societies in the history of our faith. Modern Israel is an absolute wonder. It has over 6,000 different tech startups. It received $10.5 billion in new capital funding alone in the first 6 months of 2021. In May of 2021, Israel was voted the 12th most happy country in the world, which, if you consider what was happening in May of 2021, is absolutely extraordinary. And look at how we, the American Jewish community, are holding up, even in the middle of a pandemic. We're not persecuted like our ancestors were. Our synagogues, thank God, have security, but they aren't being burned to the ground in pogroms. I wear a kippah on the streets of East Cobb in Atlanta. You can wear your mezuzah on your neck, and you can proudly identify as a Jew. Yet we must not forget that at the root of our Jewish privilege was not that we had or have had everything given to us on a silver platter. What we have was built on the sacrifice of Jews who for thousands of years lived in survival mode without a Jewish state. Those were the darkest days in our history, where we had to use our creativity to survive, where we were a people without an Israel who lived or died on the whim of whatever anti-Semitic wind was blowing. This summer, we were reminded loud and clear that there are many, many more people than we would have thought in the world who wish that we could go back to those days, making our greatest Jewish privilege, Israel, not a gift on a silver platter, but like our ancestors, a privilege that we must work hard to earn and to fight for every day if we're going to keep it. And so let us not disappoint Israel now. Let us not let the charges of 34% of American Jews who live in ignorance of their own history remain unanswered. As educated Jews, we can recognize Israel is not a perfect country, like America is not a perfect country, while also making sure that people understand the miracle of Israel's resiliency. We can disagree about matters of Israeli policy, who to vote for in the Knesset election, while telling our elected officials here in America to support positions that will ensure Israel's survival, like Iron Dome. And most importantly, after this summer, we can remind our elected officials that talk during good times is cheap. And it's only when you have 4,300 rockets overhead and you choose to speak out that we know who our real friends are. Because what Israel has built is better than any computer game or simulation. As I have to remind Zev, it's better than any Minecraft mod ever built. Israel is real. She is amazing. And this new year, whatever the world may be choosing to celebrate this week, let's make sure that that whole world never forgets about the Jewish state. Amen.